And probably see, I'll be up in heaven while y'all are rotting in hell.
I'm leaving. I'm glad. Thanks a lot, society, for railroading my ass. And I cannot go in the execution chamber and be executed under the devil. I have to come clean and cleanse my spirit in the name of Jesus Christ.
She was sitting just hours away from death, and she wasn't breaking down. No tears, no panic, no last-minute plea for mercy. Instead, Aileen Wuornos looked into the camera and spoke like she had already accepted something most people would never be able to face. She talked about heaven, about angels, about being cleaned before meeting God. And then, almost casually, she dismissed the entire system that was about to end her life, like it had no real power over her anymore. There was no visible fear in her voice. If anything, there was certainty. The kind of certainty that feels unsettling when it comes from someone condemned for multiple murders. Because this wasn't just another execution case. This was a woman who had spent years on death row, branded as one of America's most infamous female serial killers. And yet, in her final moments, she didn't behave like someone losing everything. She behaved like someone convinced she was right. And that contradiction is what makes her story so disturbing. How does someone accused of killing 7 men sit calmly in front of death and speak like this? Was it delusion, defiance, or something deeper that never got fully understood? Because before the headlines, before the trials, before the world turned her into a symbol of horror and controversy, there was a beginning no one could ignore.
And that beginning was far darker than most people realize. Aileen Wuornos didn't grow up in anything close to a stable home. From the very beginning, her life was marked by instability, abandonment, and a level of dysfunction that most people would struggle to even imagine. Her mother was still a teenager when she gave birth. Her father was absent and later connected to serious criminal history. There was no foundation of safety, no consistent parental presence, and no real sense of protection during her earliest years. And then, everything collapsed even further. After her parents disappeared from her life, Aileen and her brother were placed with their grandparents. But instead of becoming a safe refuge, that home became another source of trauma. Inside those walls, violence wasn't occasional, it was routine. Alcohol, aggression, and emotional chaos shaped daily life. And according to later accounts, Aileen was exposed to severe physical abuse during her childhood, along with disturbing violations that no child should ever endure. What makes this even more disturbing is the silence around it. Neighbors reportedly noticed something was wrong. There were signs, there were sounds, there were patterns that suggested something deeply unhealthy was happening inside that household. But like many cases from that time, nothing intervened in time to change the outcome. And at the center of it all was a child learning one brutal lesson. No one is coming to save you. Her grandmother's role in the home only deepened the damage. Instead of protection, there was denial. In some accounts, even blame was shifted onto Aileen herself, as if she were responsible for what she was enduring. That kind of environment doesn't just hurt a child, it distorts their understanding of trust, safety, and reality itself. And then there was her mother, a figure who appeared and disappeared unpredictably, sometimes gone for long stretches, other times returning in a state of emotional instability. Any hope of consistency was constantly broken again and again. Every time Aileen was pulled back into what looked like stability, it would collapse shortly after. That repeated cycle of hope and abandonment started to shape something much deeper inside her. By the time she was still very young, the emotional damage was already visible. Anger issues, aggressive behavior, trouble in school, an inability to regulate emotion or trust authority figures. But beneath all of that was something more important. A child who had learned that the world was not safe, not predictable, and not fair. And once that belief takes root that early in life, it doesn't stay contained. It starts to shape every decision that comes after. And for Aileen, those decisions were about to push her far beyond the edge of survival.
and into a completely different world.
By her mid-teens, Aileen Wuornos was no longer living a structured life in any sense. The idea of home had already collapsed, and what remained was a constant state of movement, unstable, unpredictable, and driven entirely by survival. There was no routine anymore, no school system, no consistent adult presence to guide her. Life had narrowed down to something far more immediate, finding a way to get through each day safely. She moved between temporary places to stay, often relying on whatever environments offered the least risk at that moment. Nothing was stable, and nothing was guaranteed. Every decision was reactive, shaped by urgency rather than planning. In situations like this, a person doesn't develop normally. They adapt to instability as if it's the default setting of life. Over time, that creates a mindset where long-term thinking fades, replaced entirely by short-term survival responses. Education and structure disappeared completely from her life. Without guidance or support, there was no clear direction forward, only a series of disconnected days where she had to navigate uncertainty on her own. As these years went on, the emotional toll began to accumulate. Repeated instability and exposure to unsafe environments gradually changed how she related to the world. Trust became limited, caution increased, and emotional distance became a way to cope with constant unpredictability. Then came a major turning point during her teenage years. At around 14 years old, she became pregnant.
It was a moment that brought no stability or support with it. Instead, it added another layer of emotional strain to an already fragile situation. The child was later given up for adoption, marking another separation in a life already defined by loss and instability. After this, her circumstances became even harder to escape. By the time she reached later adolescence, there was no foundation left to return to, no structure, no support system, and no clear path forward. Survival remained the only consistent focus. During this period, she eventually found herself relying on unsafe and unstable means to support herself financially. The environments she was exposed to were harsh and required constant caution and emotional detachment simply to navigate. Over time, this way of living reshaped her perspective. Continuous exposure to instability and hardship often leads to emotional numbing as a coping mechanism, and in her case, that process developed gradually rather than suddenly. This phase of her life didn't define everything that came after, but it did set the psychological groundwork for the next stage, where survival would begin to turn into something far more unstable and dangerous.
By the time Aileen Wuornos reached adulthood, survival was no longer something she was just reacting to. It had become the only way she knew how to exist. But what's more important is what happens after years of constant instability. At some point, a person doesn't just adapt anymore. They start to change internally in ways that are harder to see from the outside. For Aileen, that change didn't happen in one moment. It built slowly, layer by layer, through loss, isolation, and repeated exposure to situations that offered no real safety or emotional grounding. Relationships in her life were unstable or short-lived. Trust was difficult to maintain, and any sense of long-term direction had been replaced by a focus on immediate survival. Over time, that kind of life creates emotional pressure that doesn't simply disappear. It builds quietly in the background until it starts affecting how a person sees everything around them. In Aileen's case, her perception of people and the world around her became increasingly shaped by negative and painful experiences. She began to view relationships through a lens of caution and distrust, and emotional distance became a way to avoid further harm. Then came a moment that intensified everything. The loss of her brother, one of the few people she had ever felt a genuine connection with, hit her deeply. It removed one of the last remaining emotional anchors in her life. After that, she was essentially alone. No stable family structure, no long-term support system, no clear path forward, just a series of unstable environments and difficult experiences that continue to accumulate over time. And this is where something important happens psychologically. When someone goes through prolonged instability combined with repeated emotional loss, it can lead to a breakdown in how they process trust, safety, and control. Not instantly, but gradually, as coping mechanisms begin to shift. For Aileen, emotional regulation became more difficult. Anger became more present, and her ability to see situations in a balanced way started to narrow under the weight of everything she had experienced. It's important to understand this stage not as a single event, but as a buildup. Nothing changed overnight. Instead, everything she had lived through started to converge into a mindset where survival and emotional defense were no longer separate things. They were becoming the same response. And once a person reaches that point, even small decisions can start to carry much larger consequences. Because from here, the line between survival and something far more destructive begins to blur. And Aileen was getting closer to that line with every passing year.
The shift didn't happen with a warning. There was no clear moment where everything suddenly changed, no dramatic signal that things had gone too far. Instead, it began with one encounter that would later be described very differently depending on who was telling the story. Aileen Wuornos would always insist the first killing was an act of self-defense, that she had been in danger, that she reacted to survive. But what followed is where everything starts to unravel. Because after that first death, it didn't stop. Over the next several months, a pattern began to form, one that investigators couldn't ignore. Men would go missing. Their vehicles would later be found abandoned. Personal belongings would disappear. And eventually, their bodies would be discovered, often in isolated areas, far from where they were last seen. Each case carried similarities that were hard to dismiss. The same type of weapon, the same general method, the same aftermath. Valuables taken, identities erased, scenes left behind. And as the pattern became clearer, so did the concern. This wasn't random, it was consistent. And consistency suggests control.
Aileen continued to claim that each situation was a reaction, that she was protecting herself in dangerous encounters. But as more evidence came together, investigators began to see gaps in that explanation. In several cases, there were signs that didn't fully match a struggle. The positioning, the repetition, the follow-up actions. Taken individually, each case could raise questions, but together, they told a much more complete story. And that story pointed towards something more deliberate. At the same time, she wasn't just disappearing after these incidents. There were traces, vehicles being used, items being sold or traded, movements that slowly built a trail behind her without her realizing how visible it was becoming. And that's the thing about patterns. They don't just reveal behavior, they make it easier to follow. Because once investigators understand how something is happening, it becomes only a matter of time before they connect it to who is responsible. And in Aileen's case, that time was running out. Because while she may have believed she was staying ahead of everything, the evidence was quietly building, and it was about to catch up to her all at once.
In the end, it wasn't one dramatic mistake that exposed everything. It was a series of small ones, quietly stacking up. The turning point came after a car crash in Florida. At first, it didn't seem connected to anything major, just an abandoned vehicle after an accident. But when authorities took a closer look, they found something that changed everything. Fingerprints. And not just any fingerprints, ones that matched a name already in the system. That was the first real crack. From there, investigators started pulling on the thread, and the more they looked, the more connections appeared. Items linked to missing men had been sold in different places. Transactions had been made under aliases, but the patterns were still there. Each piece on its own wasn't enough, but together they began forming a clear picture. And then came the most critical move. Instead of going straight for a high-risk arrest tied to multiple serious charges, officers approached it differently. They picked a smaller, unrelated warrant, something that would allow them to bring her in quietly, without alerting anyone else connected to her. It worked. Aileen Wuornos was taken into custody without a scene. But the investigation wasn't complete yet, because there was still someone else they needed. Someone who could either confirm or complicate everything. Her partner.
When authorities located her, they presented the situation clearly. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of being implicated, she made a decision that would change the entire case. She agreed to cooperate. What followed were a series of recorded phone calls, conversations designed to feel natural but carefully guided. Over time, the pressure built, the tone shifted, and eventually, something critical happened. Aileen started to open up. During one of those calls, she admitted involvement in the incidents, but maintained that her actions were tied to self-defense. That recording became a turning point. Because now, investigators didn't just have physical evidence, they had her own words. From that moment on, everything moved quickly. Ballistic reports connected multiple cases to the same weapon. Items belonging to victims were traced back to her. The timeline aligned. The pattern was confirmed. What had once been a series of separate investigations became one unified case. And the focus was now clear. Aileen Wuornos wasn't just a suspect anymore. She was at the center of it all. And with the evidence stacking up from every direction, the next phase was inevitable. The courtroom. Once the case reached the courtroom, it didn't take long for Aileen Wuornos to become more than just a defendant. She became a story. The charges were severe, and the evidence presented against her was difficult to ignore. Physical links, recorded statements, and a clear pattern connecting multiple incidents. From a legal standpoint, the case moved forward with a strong sense of direction. But outside the courtroom, something very different was happening. The media had picked it up, and they didn't treat it like an ordinary case. Coverage spread quickly. Interviews, headlines, televised updates. The public wasn't just watching, they were forming opinions. And those opinions were split in a way that made the case even more complicated. Some people saw her as exactly what the prosecution described, a calculated offender responsible for a series of deliberate acts. But others saw something else. They looked at her background, the instability, the repeated trauma, the years of survival under extreme conditions. And instead of seeing only the crimes, they saw a person shaped by circumstances that went far beyond a single decision. That divide created tension around the case, because it wasn't just about what happened, it was about how to interpret it. Even in court, Aileen didn't present herself in a predictable way. At times, she seemed direct and composed. At other moments, her tone shifted, becoming more defensive or frustrated.
She continued to insist that her actions were tied to situations where she felt threatened, but the prosecution focused on the consistency in the evidence, the repeated patterns, the follow-up actions, and the lack of clear signs that supported her version in several instances. In the end, the court reached its decision. In 1992, she was sentenced to death. And even then, the debate didn't stop. If anything, it grew stronger. Because now, the question wasn't just about guilt. It was about how to define her. Was she fully responsible for everything that happened? Or was she the result of a system that failed long before the crimes ever occurred? As the years passed, her case continued to attract attention. Documentaries were made. Journalists revisited her story. Filmmakers explored different perspectives. Each version added another layer to how the public understood her. But while the outside world kept debating, Aileen was still inside, waiting. And over time, something about her behavior began to change again. Something that would make her final days even more unsettling than anyone expected.
As the execution date got closer, something about Aileen Wuornos began to shift. Not in a calm or predictable way, but in a way that left many people unsettled. In her final interviews, her tone became more intense, more unpredictable. At times, she spoke clearly and directly, but then, without warning, her words would turn into a stream of accusations about the system, about the people around her, even about what she believed was happening to her inside the prison. She claimed she was being mistreated, that something was being done to her behind the scenes, that she wasn't being treated fairly in ways the public couldn't see. Whether those claims were grounded in reality or not, one thing was clear: she fully believed what she was saying. At the same time, another side of her became more visible: a strong focus on religion. She spoke about God, about forgiveness, about going somewhere better after death. It gave her a sense of certainty, almost like she had already accepted what was coming and reframed it into something she could face without fear. That contrast made her final days difficult to interpret. On one side, anger and distrust. On the other, faith and acceptance. And both seemed to exist at the same time. Then came the final morning. Everything moved with precision. There were no dramatic scenes, no resistance. She followed instructions, stayed composed, and didn't create any disruption. When given options for a final meal, she declined most of them, keeping things simple. She didn't ask for long conversations. She didn't reach out to people. It was as if she had already made peace with being alone in that moment. As the time approached, she was escorted to the execution chamber. No visible panic, no hesitation, just steady movement forward. When asked if she had any final words, she spoke with the same strange certainty that had defined her final days, mixing personal belief with something that didn't fully align with how most people would face that moment. Then the process began. Medical staff followed protocol carefully. Each step was controlled, documented, and carried out without deviation. Within minutes, the procedure was complete. At 9:47 a.m., she was pronounced dead. And just like that, it was over. No final outburst, no last-minute reversal, just a quiet ending to a life that had been anything but quiet. But even after her death, the questions didn't disappear. If anything, they became even harder to answer. You'd expect a story like this to end with the execution, a clear conclusion, a closed chapter. But in Aileen Wuornos' case, that's not what happened. Because after her death, her story didn't fade. It spread. Books were written, documentaries were released, interviews resurfaced, and soon her life was being retold from completely different angles, each one trying to answer the same uncomfortable question. Who was she, really? Some portrayals focused on the crimes, the pattern, the evidence, the outcome. In those versions, she remains exactly what the court concluded. But other interpretations took a different path. They went back to the beginning. The instability, the isolation, the years of surviving in environments that offered no protection. And from that perspective, her story looked less like a sudden descent and more like a slow buildup that was never interrupted. One of the biggest shifts in public perception came when her life was adapted into film. For many viewers, it was the first time they saw her not just as a headline, but as a person shaped by circumstances. That didn't change what happened, but it changed how people talked about it. And that's why her case still stands out, because it refuses to sit comfortably in just one category. It forces a difficult conversation about responsibility, about environment, about how much of a person is shaped by what they go through, and how much comes down to their choices. Even years later, there's no single answer everyone agrees on. Some see a clear line that was crossed. Others see a line that was blurred long before the crimes ever happened. And maybe that's why her story continues to resurface.
not because people are looking for closure, but because they're still trying to understand where that line really is, and whether, in cases like this, it was ever as clear as it seemed.